You're listening to WCOM LP 103.5 FM Carborough and Chapel Hill. It's a Tuesday, it's 5 o'clock, and that only means one thing. It's time for another round of Snarky Faith with your host, Stuart Deloney. This is a space where we irreverently wrestle through life, culture, and spirituality, all with our heads in the clouds, our tongues in our cheeks, our hearts in our sleeves, and our feet on the ground. At Snarky Faith, the questions or even the answers are never the point. It's all about the conversation. So here's your host, Stuart Deloney.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to another round of Snarky Faith Radio. I'm your host, Stuart Deloney. Thank you so much for joining us again this week here at Snarky Faith. I don't know about you guys. It's kind of been a weird week. I don't know if it was like the Super Bowl yawn fest, or it could have been the fact that my in-laws visited recently, so my in-laws visited recently. That's all that really needs to be said from that point. But no, I feel like, and I feel like we've touched on certain things like this in the past that, for some reason, over the past while, maybe it's been since the past 2 years-ish. No, but it feels like there's no good news in the news. So every once in a while, we try to bring you good news here at Snarky Faith, because it's easy. It's easy when we do stuff like the Christian Crazy of the Week, where we talk about, I could have this week, and we're not going to do the Christian Crazy this week. Oh, no, I'm telling you off the bat, because I want to talk about something a little bit more serious, and I'll get to that in a minute. And we do the Christian Crazy because I like to be able to skewer why Christianity in many places is so far off the reservation. It's so far off the mark that it's ridiculous. And I kind of like, in prepping for the show during the week, I find lots of crazy articles and sound bites and things like that on the internet to be able to bring to you, because it's fun to make fun of and it's fun to mock. And, this week I could have had issues like the fact that Kim Davis, remember Kim Davis? Kentucky Kim Davis? You remember her? She was the clerk that refused to issue a marriage certificate to a gay couple. Wanted to get married. Remember her? Yeah? Remember her, like the Pentecostal-looking broad? Yeah. And she wants the taxpayers to pay $225,000 for her crusade that she went on. Yeah, because that's crazy. Or I could talk to you about how different, Christians in the media are just crying out, saying that being white makes us feel persecuted. We feel like, literally, this is their quote, not mine, but that being a white Trump supporter makes them feel like they were African American back in the 50s and 60s right now. Ridiculous, I know. Fun to make fun of? Oh, of course it is. But in my regular scouring of the news and my regular kind of being depressed about the way the world is right now, when you begin to hear about the fact that, the insect population in the world is dying off. Why? Well, it's because of climate change and because of man-made problems. And maybe it's because I also spent the weekend with my in-laws that are Trump supporters that think climate change is a hoax and everything that they hear on Fox News is true. And, I'm just ignorant, and they need to sit down and tell me the truth, because you can't listen to the mainstream media. And I get more and more, in many ways, disheartened with humanity. And I want to do a show today. I actually thought about not doing a show today and say, I'm not feeling this. I'm just going to do a rerun right now, because this is just the state of the world and the state of America and the state of faith in America is just it continues to move to this sickening crescendo point. And And I kept coming back to some stories that I'd found this week. And it was stuff that really, really, really bothered me on a deeper level. And even though I like to keep stuff in many ways light and fluffy on this show that we call Snarky Faith Radio, yeah, I didn't really want to sit down and talk about this today because it didn't feel fun. It felt, yeah, it felt kind of like the state of the world today. So here's what's going to happen. And if you usually come for the fun of Snarky Faith, feel free. We'll be back again next week. If you want to go with me here on this little bit of a journey, welcome. Come and hang out. And a lot of this that I'm going to be talking through is going to be off the cuff. And I'm going to warn you in many ways that I may end up having a little bit of like circular logic on certain stuff. But really what I'm wanting you to hear from me on all of this, since I'm kind of speaking a little bit more from an emotional place, is the overall heart for what I'm going after. And what I'm really talking about, well, I feel like I need to give you a little disclaimer before I hop in. And this disclaimer is mainly about me. When we talk about topics like this, oftentimes, because you're listening to a show called Snarky Faith, I do have a tendency to get sarcastic, especially in many ways. The more disgusted I get at a situation, I tend to get more and more sarcastic. So what I will tell you is this, is I will try to curb this. It may still happen, but I will really try to curb this, because when we're talking about stuff like sexual abuse and assault in the church, this is something that really sickens me. It sickens me that this is a problem, that this is still a problem, and that it continues to go on within the Christian church. So I will try to do my best not to be sarcastic when it comes to this. And I don't mean being sarcastic about the victims. I get angry and sarcastic about the institutions that perpetuate this. So bear with me as we step forward into this. Now, over the last week, do you ever like read the news and start kind of seeing weird patterns and things? And no, I'm not wearing my tinfoil hat right now or anything like that. But there were 3 different stories that broke over the last week or two. And I think I see a little bit of a thread. See if you can figure this out too. So the article, I'll hop through 3 different articles and tell you their names and see. You can guess the connection. And if you do, you get a prize. I'm not really sure what that prize is. Maybe it's one of those gold stars that your teachers always told you were supposed to get. But the first one comes from NBC News, and it's called Ungodly Abuse: The Lasting Torment of New Tribes Missionary Kids. The next one is from the New York Times that says Sexual Abuse of Nuns: The Long-Standing Church Scandal Emerges from the Shadows. And the last one comes from the Houston Chronicle. It's the series they've been posting to. It's called Abuses of Faith: 20 years, 700 victims, Southern Baptist sexual abuse spreads as leaders resist reforms. So when we step into topics of this nature, we have to walk carefully. And I mean walk carefully in only one regard. We have to walk carefully, especially when handling victims. We have to walk carefully to be kind, to be understanding in all of this. But the more I read these articles, I do not feel kind in regards to institutions that have allowed this. Institutions like New Tribes Missions, institutions like the Catholic Church, and institutions like the Southern Baptist Church. And when we begin to talk about this, it's one of those things that it grieves me deeply. It breaks my heart. And it makes me just wonder, what is the point? In many ways, what is the point of the American church when we have rampant problems like this? And I understand we're dealing with the Catholics. We're not completely talking about the American church, but you're getting the idea. And so the way I wanted to follow this out today was really just to kind of give a brief overview from each of these articles and what's going on. And then I want to talk about why I think this happens in churches, from being a person who has worked inside of churches a lot of my career, and begin to figure out how we can stop this. Because it's easy to get mad at the perpetrators, because I think we should be. I think we should be outraged at the perpetrators. But I think the key to this is saying, how do we stop this? I mean, go after the bad guys, of course. But how can we, as the church, stop this from happening? And I have a couple ideas that I'll share with you. But before that, let's go ahead and run through each of these scandals as they have recently broken. So the first scandal is a ministry called New Tribes Missions. And they're an evangelistic missionary organization. Now, if you want to look them up these days, they're called Ethnos 360. Anyone want to take a guess why the rebranding? Why the rebranding went on? Yeah. And in this case, and in this scenario, what was happening was parents that were missionaries would take their kids in or near the field. And oftentimes the parents would have to go into areas that were more remote, and they would leave their kids at New Tribes boarding schools. And several of these boarding schools became a hotbed area for children being taken advantage of, being abused and molested. And this went on for years. And even when students were speaking out, when young people were speaking out about this, their cries fell on deaf ears, or they were told things. And I've heard things like this before working in churches. So some of these are almost like triggery for me too. It just creeps me out. But they were told, oh, we wouldn't want to damage the ministry of these men. And just to think about this, children that had been routinely abused over and over, being told by other people in authority that we don't want to damage the ministry of these predators. Yeah, let me stick to the facts for now. You'll get you'll get more of me a little bit later. I'll hold back right now, and I will tell you, and I have been around new tribes people in the past. Some of them cool, some of them weird. But again, when you're dealing with missionaries and people in the church, weirdness is relative, if that makes any sense. But again, to give you kind of a backing of where they would stand theologically, they would be seen as very, very conservative. And we'll get to more conservative mess in a little while. But the problem that happened that stemmed here, and it's a problem that we're going to start seeing a pattern over and over and over again, where the abusers get called out, but they're never reported. And when situations like this are not reported, the person's able to move along to another position and do the same things that predators do. And it's a disgusting thing, and it's a disgusting thing when we see organizations repeatedly try to cover up these abuses because they feel like the mission of God overall of the organization is more important, which is ridiculous because can you have the mission of God? Can you even be anywhere near the mission of God when you're allowing these things to happen? My answer would be no. And I know oftentimes Christians can compartmentalize this stuff, but look at the good they were doing. Look at all the good they were doing. They weren't even taking care of their own. And if the kingdom of God does not protect people from the people that are supposedly carrying out the kingdom of God, I'm not really sure what kingdom they're now a part of, because I'm pretty darn sure that God is not a part of this when heinous things like this continue to move forward and happen. So we had New Tribes Mission, yes, years of this happening, and the voices coming out over and over again, and they fell on deaf ears. Okay, so that's our first story. We're moving to our next story, where again, see if you can see the pattern that's going on here. I think you can. Onward to the Catholic Church, which is not something I really find myself enjoying saying right now. But in the article from the New York Times about sexual abuse with nuns, and the beginning of the article goes like this: sexual abuse of nuns and religious women by Catholic priests and bishops and the abortions that have sometimes resulted has been for years overshadowed by other scandals in the Roman Catholic Church. Now, why this is hitting the news recently is because, Pope Francis has actually publicly acknowledged the problem for the first time. And I know a bunch of people are like, yay, we're very happy he's acknowledging this. This is great, even though this has been going on probably for 1,000 years, if not, Jesus, Catholic Church, I don't know, 2,000 years. That's just, give or take. And I just, and I love how that we even have to say this, that, this has been this horrendous plague that has been happening wasn't noticed as much because of the other disgusting, serious plague that was abuse of children. So if we're seeing anything from this situation, this really seems like a problem that gets perpetuated by white guys in power. Oof. Because now, yes, so the Roman Catholic Church has rampant problems with molesting children and molesting women. Stuff like this, and even the fact that we have to have the other Catholic sex scandal involved in here is just mind-blowing. And yes, Pope Francis addressed it. Great. Now, I know in large old organizations like this, change comes slowly, Stuart, was what some will say. Why? When we are supposedly part of a faith that loves good and hates evil, why does change in these ranks take so long? Right? Because last time I checked, this is pretty effing evil. This is up there in those like as evil as it gets kind of categories for stuff. And again, that we're seeing in these, which we'll get more to this in a little bit later, we're seeing this perpetuated because leadership did nothing about it. And in a lot of these situations, leadership was the one actually doing it. So you either have folks that are doing this or they're sweeping it under the rug. All the while, women and children are continuing to be abused. So when I hear stuff and people applauding the Pope for actually acknowledging this, I don't buy that. I don't buy it. Condemn evil. Call it what it is. And again, what we're seeing in another pattern here, same as New Tribes, is the predator just gets passed along to a new post. And you know what happens? It doesn't get reported. And if these things are not reported, these people don't get put on a list. But again, more of that and a little bit later. And just getting back to the fact that, yay, the Pope addressed the issue. I mean, addressing a problem to an archaic system is not enough. I mean, where is the response in these situations? Where are the arrests in these situations of abuse and rape? I mean, I know all of this is a first step, but it really, really, really feels like bad lip service. Because what we're seeing here through all of these are just a culture of silence and secrecy that continues to march on. And it marches us in a direction of now talking about the Southern Baptist Convention. And the Houston Chronicle is rolling out, it's a 3-piece deep investigation that they did into the abuses of faith in the Southern Baptist churches. And even as their article says, 20 years, 700 victims, Southern Baptist sexual abuse spreads as leaders resist reforms. And in all of these situations here that we're even talking about today, and I know there's going to be other ones in other denominations that aren't just making headlines right now. So this isn't like, oh, bad on them, bad on them. There's bad that happens in other places too. More on that later. But what gets me, and this is jaw-dropping when we read these studies, a lot of these are from 2000 and on that we've been researching this. And And I'm glad they're researching this. But if you really think about this, did all of this just happen in the 2000s? Come on, like, right? This is just, the Catholic Church pretty started getting a little itch. No, this thing has been going on in all of these organizations for much, much longer than we're even hearing reports of. It's just that there have been brave individuals that have been able to come out and take a stand and call evil what it really is. So now to the Southern Baptist Church, the church of my youth. And again, within this, what are we going to see? Well, I'll tell you what the investigation found this. I'm going to quote from the investigation. At least 35 church pastors, employees, and volunteers who exhibited predatory behavior were still able to find jobs at churches during the past 2 decades. In some cases, church leaders apparently failed to alert law enforcement about complaints or to warn other congregations about allegations of misconduct. Okay? Several past presidents and prominent leaders of the Southern Baptist Convention are amongst those those criticized by victims for concealing or mishandling abuse complaints within their own churches or seminaries. Some registered sex offenders returned to the pulpit. Others remain there, including a Houston preacher who sexually assaulted a teenager and is now the principal officer in a Houston nonprofit that works with student organizations, federal records show. You know what the name of this organization is? Touching the Future Today. I could be sarcastic, but I'm not going to. Just going to let that one slide. And they also found that many of the victims were adolescents who were molested, sent explicit photos or texts, exposed to pornography, photographed nude, or repeatedly raped by youth pastors. Some victims, as young as 3, were molested or raped inside pastors' studies and Sunday school classrooms. A few were adults, women and men, who sought pastoral guidance. Instead, were seduced and sexually assaulted. Even reading down this just makes me sick. And it makes me sick because it happened. It happens in other organizations and in other companies and things like this. But I think that you tend to see rampant issues, especially in the religious world, and you see them become something that's more and more systemic. It's because, like I said before, there's oftentimes a culture of silence and secrecy that permeates these organizations. And in all 3 of these stories, we end up seeing a leadership that cared more about protecting the church or the ministry than it did about protecting people. It ends up being brand over decency, church over people. And again, let's just go ahead and say this because it needs to be said. None of this has to do with the kingdom of God, and none of this has to do with Jesus. Even though these people are doing it in the name of Jesus, and they claim that they're doing this for the kingdom of God. But all of this is evil, and all of this is sick. And I'm going to go as far to say the leaders that allowed this to go on are just as complicit in the crime as the predators. Because they knew it. They knew it. And they didn't stop it. And they allowed it to continue. It's not that this stuff ruins people's life, because it does, but it breaks something so deep within people. Especially when you're doing this in a safe space, when you're doing this in a church where it's supposed to be the place where people can find God. What safer place could there be? It breaks you. And I know many people will say, well, Stuart, there's organizations have learned that, churches have rules and policies and background checks. And yes, most do to try to protect situations like these from happening. And I still say most do, because I've also known a lot of smaller churches that don't have any policy like that. But I will tell you, most of these rules and policies come from or have come about because of lawsuits against organizations and denominations. And because of insurance, and because organizations don't want to end up paying out the money, they cover their ass with these rules and assume that will fix the problem. Because in many ways, legally speaking, it covers a good fair amount of butts from problems in this. But the real problem, and that I just really want to really get at here, is that it really comes from a cultural issue. And it comes from a cultural issue of how churches exist and how churches are set up. And again, this problem that I'm speaking about would not be something that would be biblical in nature. This is more cultural in nature of how churches have evolved and how churches see and view leadership and hierarchy within an organization and how reporting structures work and all of that stuff that doesn't sound very interesting. But because of these things, because of these structures, because of this like architecture that's been set in motion, it creates problems and it perpetuates problems. And because of these structures, this problem, sadly, will probably continue. And I hate saying that because I don't want problems like these to continue. I don't. Because churches should be a place where healing can take place. Or churches can be a place that feels safe, where it feels like you have sanctuary, where it feels like you can be part of a community. But by and large, these ideals I have in my head do not happen in reality in a corporate church. And yes, the Catholic Church is a corporate church. It looks archaic, but it's as corporate as they get. So here's my 3 ideas for why these problems happen and why they're going to continue to happen unless we address these 3 issues. The first one is this. It is the culture of fake piousness. And what I mean by that is it's this idea that the pastor is a holy man, a man that is somehow, or woman, sorry, a person that's better, a person that is perceived to be set apart by God. And of course, since the person went through seminary, a seminary is a magical process that somehow turns you into a holy man and connects you more with God. No, it doesn't. It's just college. So we end up having this system where we elevate the leaders. We elevate them. And in many church situations, we quasi or not so quasi worship them. We think that they are these holy and pure people, these perfect example of what a Christian should be. We end up almost like lifting them to a level of like, my pastor's so good, he's so smart, he's so wise. It's just like Jesus. And he leads me, and I am his sheep. But really what begins to happen within the culture of a church, and what I mean in this realm, I'm going to speak of kind of the culture of behind the scenes. And behind the scenes, working in ministry, that you're told you have to be above reproach. You have to almost be that person, because otherwise churches don't like that and they'll fire you. But really what that begins to tell people on almost a personal level, that you always have to appear holier than thou. That you need to look perfect. No wrinkles in your collar, a nice white bleached gleam in your teeth. You need to be what the people aspire to be. And so you'll have a perfect family, and everything about you will look perfect. But behind the scenes, when people are told this over and over again, really what begins to happen is they just learn to adopt a persona. They learn to adopt a persona, and because of that, you end up almost fracturing yourself to some degree. There's who you are in public, and then there's who you are in private. And like anybody else, Clergy are people. Clergy are absolutely just normal people like everyone else. They have their flaws like everyone else. They have their vices like everyone else. And what begins to happen is when you have to live out this public persona, the other side, the messy side, the side that you don't want people to see, the side that kind of makes you human, that gets buried and it gets pushed down and it gets shoved in the dark. And when you begin to do that, it begins to twist itself into areas because those things that you have that you probably need to be working through in community in healthy ways, but you can't do it because, again, the sheep will turn on you. And that brings you to the point on the flip side of the cultural thing, not the backside that most people don't see, but the front side that people do. And we've had shows about this before, but what comes into this is the fact that the congregations feed this, and it feeds the ego of the pastor, and it feeds the congregation's expectations that this person needs to be a superman, a superwoman that's up on stage, that has the best insight week after week, that just knows how to give the perfect sermon and tell you how to live the perfect life. So it becomes this thing that it's like this weird contract of sorts that happens. You know, it's almost where the congregation's like, we'll follow you as long as you look and act perfect and make us feel inferior, but then we'll learn eventually through your actions how to fake it. And so then you end up having these churches that are run by fake people and that are filled with fake people, and no one knows how to deal with their own brokenness or their own mess, and there you have it. So we end up having this culture of fake piousness that teaches us to be fake. It teaches us to put on a good face, to put on a good suit on Sunday morning and look a certain way and play a role. And things like this lead to really bad stuff happening behind the scenes. Because think about this. If clergy have already learned how to hide their mess, when they create more mess, what are they going to do? They're not going to admit to it. They're not going to seek help for it. They're going to continue to hide it because hiding is what they do. And it's hard. It's hard. I mean, I've been in situations where you're on the stage and it's easy to want to fake it. It's easy to want to seem like you have no blemishes, you have nothing going on in your life and anything else like that. Because in all honesty, no one wants to go to church where you end up having a pastor or clergy that are up there that looks like a mess. Oh, we only want to be around winners because we need to be winners too. So again, we've got a culture problem in the church. And that culture problem is exemplified by my second issue here is hierarchy, the way we structure our churches. We structure churches in a very top-down model of leadership. You've got someone at the top. They may have a little bit of an overseer board, but then that person at the top then has the people they report to, and those people have people they report to, and so on and so forth. It's, the whole kind of pyramid structure of hierarchy. And again, when we do this, those kind of structures lend themselves for power trips. They lend themselves for covering up problems. They lend themselves for a lack of authenticity and a huge disconnect between what happens behind the scenes at a church and what happens on Sunday morning, from what the congregation knows and what the congregation doesn't know. And those type of hierarchical structures just lend themselves to more and more problems. And they make things easier and easier to hide. I'll give you an example. Early in my ministry career, I was a youth pastor, and I was working for a Foursquare church. If you don't know Foursquare, it's kind of like charismatic Pentecostal, that ilk of folk. Yes, a Southern Baptist boy that went all the way to the other spectrum, one crazy to another crazy. And so it's the first time I think I've ever taken kids, and it was a big denominational summer camp, and it's like day 3 or 4 of camp, and I have a young woman come up to me, and she pulls me aside and says, "I need to talk to you." And she proceeds to tell me that one of the counselors had been inappropriately touching her friend, and her friend didn't want to say anything because she didn't want to get in trouble, and she was afraid that she was bad because this happened. And again, when I talk about how this psychologically damages and hurts people, all this stuff's happening in a place that's supposed to be all about God and goodness and grace and compassion and love, but doesn't. And so I hear this immediately, and so it was like towards the end of like all the activities in the evening. So I go and I tell one of like the leaders from our church, "Hey, this is happening, or this had happened," and they were like, "Well, do you, it." We can probably talk about this in the morning, which, first of all, shocked the out of me. Yeah, it really just, I did not know what to do. And in my impulsiveness of not even knowing, back in the beautiful day before I knew how to be political in churches and how to side talk stuff, I said, absolutely not. Because nowadays, I probably would have directly gone to the leader of the camp. I told the person, absolutely not. This, I'm not leaving. I'm not leaving. This kid is not going back to the cabin with that counselor there. So fine, I eventually made the person that was one of my superiors in that church come with me, and we went and woke up the director of the camp. The director of the camp again gave me something along those lines. Well, we can kind of deal with the stuff in the morning, and I said no. I was like, there's no way that these girls are going to sleep in that cabin tonight. We probably need to move this person away from this. And so eventually, after me saying I'm not leaving this room with these girls, I'm not sending them back there, they eventually acquiesced and tried to separate them from that person for the rest of camp. Now, do you hear what I'm saying here? That nothing was really done during camp. And as soon as I got back, I went and started going above the people that ran the denominational camp and asking questions. My senior pastor got really angry at me for making this a big deal. And eventually what it led to be was having some sort of a conversation mediated between another pastor, the victim, and the perpetrator, and really nothing beyond that. What I knew from behind the scenes, which is why the person that originally did not even want to go to the camp director told me, was I know this the type of family this girl comes from, and she's probably just making this up. And I remember just being absolutely floored and shocked and horrified. And it feels weird even going back there in my mind right now that a person that has children that has their own children would react in such a way. So I've worked for other churches where there has been weird affairs and weird sexual stuff in it, and it gets brushed under the rug. And like in the situations, if you read more into what's happened with all these organizations, what ends up happening is it gets reported, it gets swept under the rug, and the person either remains in their position or they get moved to a different place. And so on and so on and so on again. And that leads me also just to another point too. So we went through the culture of fake piousness. Our second one is a hierarchy that lends itself towards secrets and power plays and denials and people judging people for standing up and saying I was abused. I mean, in a similar but different situation, I've been in a church where there was a staff member that ended up having an affair with somebody else, and the church just spun it as this person was looking for another job somewhere else. And the church didn't want the man's wife and kids to remain in the church because it was too messy. And I know that's different, but that's still a form of abuse too. But when I see this, again, I've just seen it time and time again where they sweep stuff under the rug and they don't report, they don't tell, they don't inform anything. And by and large, I think the congregations a lot of times, you're going to get, people may get mad at me for saying this, are actually fine with the delusion. They'd rather not deal with ickiness. They would rather not deal with human evil and human messiness. But the sad fact of that is, when I talk about cultures and hierarchies, is the church should be the one place for people to go and be open about their messiness and hopefully find healing, and not find places to repress or places to be predators because they know they can get away with it. Churches should be places where people are allowed to be honest and real and messy because God knows it. So why do we have to continue to perpetuate these all of this fakeness, because none of this has to do with the kingdom of God. None of this has to do with the teachings of Jesus. None of this, none of this, none of this, none of this. This is just about power structures and oftentimes money. My third one, it's one of the problems, and it's a way that we can change and begin to reform this. So if we could get rid of fake culture and get rid of hierarchy that allows people to hide, we also need to talk about how we talk about sex in church. Because I know in most of these, we speak about sex in these arcane, like medieval terms. Like our sexual ethics are terrible and repressive and by and large, I think the people that are preaching these sexual ethics don't even believe in what they're preaching. And so it begins to just add to this. It adds to this weight. It adds to this hiding. It adds to this lying. It adds to this culture where nothing is real at all. Nothing is real and people get hurt. Because when they go through this, when I read through this about the Southern Baptist Convention and just the systematic denials they had, one thing that conservatives do exceedingly well is they know how to blame women. And the Southern Baptist Church had a history of blaming the women for coming out, blaming the accusers. Whether it be, well, anyone heard this one before? Maybe you were dressed a little too provocatively. To where the people that were hurt and abused are told they're the ones with the problem. I've mentioned this before because I think this is, again, if we're talking arcane, like the Billy Graham rule that tells pastors they are not allowed to be seen in public with a member of the opposite sex. So if someone's going to go out to lunch, even with a staff member, you can't do that. You can't do that because we want to stay as far away from sin as possible, because what that message in that Billy Graham rule is that somehow men can't control themselves. And if they can't control themselves, it's really women's fault for what they do. And it's sick and it's antiquated and it's not even antiquated. Antiquated would mean that it made sense before. It's Neanderthal thinking, and it's thinking that creates these situations where people that are hurt continue to get hurt. But what it also tells us is we end up continuing in that same thing I said earlier of having this fake piousness. I mean, you see it, like I do, being in youth ministry and being a youth pastor for years. There's this whole purity culture when we talk about sex and we talk about things like this, and we talk about it in terms of like sex is bad, it's awful, it's gross, it's dirty, it makes God sick. But if you're married and if you're doing it to make babies, then it's beautiful. But only then, only in a committed marriage, and if you're making babies. And the problem is when we begin to tell, like we do this from kids at a younger age, we begin to tell them that you can't do this and God hates this and God won't love you if this happens. And you have to make sure that you keep it locked down in a chastity belt, right? And most of the burden of this gets thrust on who again? Women and teenage girls, which again creates this warped view of who they are as women and who they are as a child of God. And again, what begins to happen, since we're not talking about this in realistic terms, we're talking about this in terms that parents love to see on stage on a Sunday morning when kids get purity rings. The problem is there's no healthy dialogue about sex in the church. It doesn't happen. And the more conservative you get, the weirder you get in those regards. But either way, sex by and large is seen as something that is bad, that we need to fear, instead of something that is a gift of God. I mean, if we're created in God's image, right? If we're created in God's image, that would also mean that sex is God ordained, right? Let's just use this basic knowledge, like this basic logic here, right? Because God could have made humans with sexual organs that weren't pleasurable. Now I know you can say evolution and this kind of stuff. Yeah. But if you're thinking too scientifically right now. I'm kind of busting down the logic of the conservatives here. So don't even get with evolution. They would have left, even if you use it in a different context. No, but think about this. And if anyone has ever read Old Testament, Song of Solomon, that is one dirty book. That is one book that you need to sit back and read with someone you love, with the lights down low. But instead, we've created cultures that end up saying that sex is bad, which ends up creating this repressive nature to things where we fake it and then we take our junk underground and it ends up erupting in weird ways. I mean, even if you look at the basic structure of the Catholic Church, where if people love God and feel called to be able to serve God their whole life, what's the first thing they need to give up? They have to have a vow of chastity. They give up sex for the rest of their lives. And if we are made in God's image and we are sexual beings, what have we just done to these people? And then on top of it, I've always wondered this about the Catholic Church, where you have priests that like to give people advice, to give newlyweds advice, or give married people advice because the priests and the nuns are married to God or something like that. But these are people that are literally like doomed to be chaste and single for the rest of their lives, but instead they're trying to give us sexual ethics. And all of this can be stopped if people in these institutions and organizations can just start being honest, just start being real with their junk and what's going on. Now, let me really clarify here, because I just realized where that could have been misconstrued. The predators need to go get help elsewhere, away from the church, away from the people. That needs to be said there. I just meant like the marginal people before they start doing really bad things, or people before they start faking it and turning faith into some sort of a weird pressure cooker. But a healthy church should be a church where people feel comfortable to be honest, where people feel comfortable to seek help, where people feel comfortable to help other people, and where they're not judged, they're not looked down upon, where they're not held to standards that weren't even set forth in the Bible. We need to have a more healthy sexual ethic in the church. And we need to have a more open structure in the church. And the church needs to be more honest. And the things that prevent this from happening are power and money. Two things that Jesus spoke out against quite a bit. Because a church that speaks of sex in a healthy and beautiful way, a church that respects all people in the eyes of God, not just the holy ones that are in a pulpit that's higher than everybody else, and a church where people can be real. That's the kind of church that sounds like Jesus, not these other ones. So I'm sorry today if this was a bit of a downer, but these are the things that we need to be talking about. These are the things that I think we need to continue to push back and say, this is not okay. And I hope organizations like this will continue to close. And I hope more and more people will have the strength, or hopefully the support system, to be able to call out their accusers and report them, to not leave them and to not leave their accusations and reports in the hands of church leadership that doesn't want scandal, that doesn't want to mess up the brand, that doesn't want to stop the cash cow. My hope would be that this can change. My hope would be that the abuse can stop. And hopefully we can get back to doing the things that Jesus would care about. And stop being a church that exemplifies things that would piss Jesus off. Well, that's all I've got this week. Just a reminder as we end this broadcast that you can catch us on podcast at www.snarkyfaith.com. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter. And as we walk out into this week, I send you with hope for a better day, and grace and peace and snark. I'm out of here.
WCOM is listener-supported community radio, and Snarky Faith is only possible through our sponsors. Lumen, a spiritual community of seekers, sojourners, question-askers, doubters, and skeptics, is a collective of fellow travelers that embrace the truth that all of life is sacred, hope is real, and tomorrow can be a better day than today. All are welcome. You can find more information at www.lumencommunities.com.